Ask me how funny it would be if I just said no. Yeah, I texted a coworker recently. I was like, I think I'm secretly an agent of chaos, and sometimes I have to rein that in. So I'm gonna try to do that tonight. Yeah, they said it's not that secret when they when I said it. They said everyone kind of knows that. So hey, we are going to talk about this story tonight in John 8, and I was really excited to get to preach this because it's a fantastic story, super famous story in the Bible. Oh, I'm getting some feedback.
Sorry,
That's your phone. Feel like I'm in school right now. Turn your phone off or turn the ringer off at least. All right. So now that we're done being interrupted so rudely by our pastor, I'm going to get to preaching. Now I'm so thrown off. I can't even remember if I turned my clicker on. I feel like I do this every time. Oh, thanks. Great. I was going to read it again, but I'm actually going to go past that. Okay, cool. So hey, this story that Nate just read for us, in John 8, again, I said it's super, super famous. So I wanted to start with two ways I see this story used wrongly before I talk about what I think this story means. And these are two distortions that I want you to hear right now that I am not saying tonight. Okay. So the first one is that Jesus does not care about sin. Okay. So sometimes I hear that with this story. That clearly can't be true. Like Jesus died because of sin. So that is something that he takes seriously. The Bible describes sin as an enemy of God and of us. Okay, so Jesus does take sin seriously. And even in the book of Romans, in Romans chapter 6, verse 15, the Apostle Paul confirms this when he says, "What then? Are we to sin because we are not under law, but under grace? By no means." Okay, so that's the first thing I want you to hear that the story is not saying. Okay, the story is not saying that Jesus doesn't care about sin. The second thing that the story is not saying, and you won't hear me say tonight, is that we are in no way, shape, or form to judge others. And that one is, I think, a little bit trickier for me to say and for you to hear, perhaps. But I think Jesus is really careful in the words that he uses here. I think he also, when he talks in the Sermon on the Mount about judgment, and he says, judge not. The next line he says is, "You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." I think that he gives us an obligation to take the speck out of our brother's eye, but after we have taken the log out of our own. We also see in the Old Testament, there's public accountability to a lot of the laws that God provides. And then in 1 Corinthians, so in the New Testament, it confirms it in chapter 5, where it says, "But now I am writing you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of a brother if he is guilty of sexual immorality or greed, or is an idolater, reveler, drunkard, or swindler, not even to eat with such a one. For what have I to do with judging outsiders? Is it not those inside the church whom you are to judge? God judges those outside. Purge the evil person from among you." So I just want to start with, these are the two things that I am not saying. I think they're there in kind of popular Christian culture, but that is not the message that I think we're going to hear from this story tonight. So let's talk about the message that is there in the story. And to do that, there are three main characters. We're going to look at each character. We're going to look at their perspective and maybe a lesson that we can learn from each of them. So the three characters we find in the story are the woman, the crowd, and Jesus. And this is the favorite picture I think I've ever seen of Jesus. And I thought it was well fitting for his role tonight as a star in the story. So let's go to the crowd first, and let's talk about them. So the crowd in the story is made up mostly of legal scholars and biblical teachers, which are the scribes and the Pharisees. In this story, though, the crowd is really interesting. Like, if you look at their motivation, they don't care that much about the law. They don't care that much about sin. In verse 6 of the story, it said they said this to test him, right? The reason for this trap that they set for Jesus was to get him in trouble, in hot water. It wasn't because they cared about the sin this woman was committing. It was more about Jesus. So let's talk about the test, this trap that they set up. Well, it's intended to be lose-lose. Like Jesus is not supposed to be able to get out of it easily. He either doesn't forgive the woman, like that is one option in this trap. And if he doesn't forgive the woman, well, we've seen all in the Gospel of John so far, Jesus being this like super awesome guy, super loving. He forgives people of sins. And like that's something that the religious teachers really didn't like. And we saw that earlier in the book of John when he heals someone on the Sabbath and he seems to be breaking their laws. And he offers to forgiveness of sins with that. And they're like, you can't do that. Only God can forgive sins. So either in the story, he doesn't forgive this woman's sins and he said, yeah, stone her. Or the other option is he's not that serious about the law. And if he's not that serious about the law, then, I mean, why should they follow him, right? Like they know the law that's been revealed by God. So if Jesus isn't synonymous or working with the law, then that's a problem. And even in Jesus' own words in Matthew 5, he says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth passes away, not an iota, not a dot, will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So if Jesus just says, oh, it's not a big deal that she was caught in adultery, don't stone her, well, then those words that Jesus just said in Matthew 5, like he doesn't really mean it, right? He doesn't mean what he says. And then he's not a serious teacher and no one follows him. And that was part of the problem with the scribes and Pharisees. They were jealous because Jesus was amassing quite a following. The other reason this is a test, though, that I recently kind of thought about is it puts Jesus at odds with Roman law. So I've been reading John in my own quiet time, studying that. And I've gotten to the point where Jesus dies. So spoiler, I know we're not there yet. That's going to happen in the story. But one of the interesting things in that story is like the Jewish leaders don't just stone him, even though he's claiming to be the Son of God, because that would be a problem for the Romans. So they take him to Pilate, who has authority, like in the Roman law, and they ask him to be crucified. So if Jesus says, let's stone this woman, then all of a sudden he's breaking this Roman law where they're in authority. And you know what could happen? Insurrection. Let's call it that. Jesus gets put to death. And then, Jesus is kind of out of the religious teacher's way. So this is the intended trap for Jesus. It seems unpassable. The other clue we have to their motivation, though, is if we look back at the law in the Old Testament that commands the people what to do in this situation. So Leviticus 20:10 is where they get this idea where they can bring this woman caught in adultery to Jesus and say, let's stone her. They do have kind of authority to do that based on this law. So it says in Leviticus 20, if a man commits adultery with a wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death. What's really, really interesting when you read this verse and then you look at the story is there's something missing here. The adulterer, right? She was caught in the act of adultery. Where's the man? They should both, I hear like some amens from the women in the front. They should both be brought here to be put to death. So, and the other thing is with that, it's not that the man wasn't caught, right? They were caught in the act of adultery. The man was there. The crowd just didn't care about sin that much, right? That wasn't the point of this. They weren't trying to expel or purge the evil from among them. Instead, they thought this woman was disposable. This was a trap. They didn't care about the sin part of this. And I think that's really, really relevant to the story. Okay, so as we look at their motivations, they're disingenuous. They don't care that much about sin because they didn't bring the man. So let's talk about the woman. And my slides look a lot better than, I guess maybe you guys downloaded them, but I promise they look nicer on my computer. She's nothing more than a pawn in a game. And I think sometimes we make her out to be a pawn too, and we forget that she is a real person who is experiencing real feelings in this moment. I think we can get judgmental in the same way the crowd does because it helps us feel better about ourselves. And we're like, at least we're not like the woman, right? At least I would never be caught doing something like that. So I want you to imagine with me for a moment what it might be like to be the woman. She was just caught doing this terrible thing, breaking the law. A very vulnerable state, I would imagine they brought her out in. I would imagine I'd be embarrassed. They're talking about killing me. I would imagine I'd be terrified because I don't know what's going to happen. Like, I don't know Jesus is going to make the crowd go away. I imagine that this would be a pretty vulnerable moment in my life, that I'd feel ashamed of what I did. This is the state of the woman. She is not just some pawn here, like she is a person. And I feel more compassion for her. I had talked about Romans 6 before, and I read Romans 6 quite a bit to prepare for this. But I'm going to read some excerpts from that to help us again understand the plight of this woman. So Romans 6:15 through 16, and I'll skip to 20 through 21. It says, "What then? Are we to sin because we are not under the law, but under grace? By no means. Do you not know if you present yourself to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves to the one whom you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to righteousness? For when you were slaves of sin, you were free in regard to righteousness. But what fruit were you getting at that time from the things which you are now ashamed? For the end of those things is death." This woman was stuck in slavery, as Romans 6 says, to sin. When you're stuck in slavery, you don't have a whole lot of ways to get yourself free from that, right? She needed to be set free. She needed a rescuer. And look at the fruit she reaped from that, right? She wasn't being treated unfairly. And that's one of the hard parts of the story. She wasn't being treated unfairly. We read the law in Leviticus. This is exactly what she deserved and exactly what was supposed to happen. Romans 6:23, "For the wages of sin is death." That's not something she can rescue herself from. What's really interesting too, I don't know what I'm doing. Great, thanks. Then is Jesus' response in light of all of this. So how will Jesus manage this test? Again, this story is about him, right? He is set in this place where he's asked to engage with what's really political theater. I think that's a word from today that we could use maybe to describe this. And the crowd brings this woman to her, and what does he do? He bends down and he writes in the dirt. That's interesting. There's so many theories about what he writes in the dirt. The most common one is he's writing maybe like the 10 Commandments or the law. So then the people see it and get convicted. But one of the things I noticed in the story is John doesn't think it's important to tell us. So if John doesn't think it's important, I can't take too much stock in it myself. So then what kind of picture does that give me of Jesus when he just is writing in the dirt and we have no idea what he's writing? Well, I think the first thing I notice is he's not really that interested in this whole situation, right? He's not interested in what the crowd is saying and asking him. And then they keep bugging him. So they keep asking. And then I think Jesus, eventually kind of gives in and he gives a pretty genius response. He says, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." He's not saying here that she doesn't deserve to be stoned, because again, we read the law, she does. But I think his statement is asking the crowd to take a good hard look at themselves. Was this really about rooting out sin? Was that really the thing they cared about here? Was this how they wanted to be met in their own moments of failure? And what's really, really interesting about this is we actually know who should cast the first stone if you know the law very well. So going back to another Old Testament law in Deuteronomy 17:7, it says, "The hand of the witness will be the first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hand of the people. So you shall purge the evil from your midst." Which that line actually we had heard already in Corinthians. But the reason for this command in Deuteronomy that the witness should be the one to cast that first stone is because then we couldn't falsely accuse each other without maybe bearing some guilt in that, right? Like I put someone to death, that's my fault. So we know who should cast the first stone. It's whoever found the woman. I think that this is a claim then at how disingenuous this was in the first place. That their desire wasn't really to purge the evil from among them. Like, that's not what they were here for. That's not what they were about. And I think that's what Jesus is calling to mind when he says, let him who is without sin cast the first stone. Right? If this is really about purging out the evil, great. You know who should cast out the first stone. That's not my job to call. And Jesus, he could have led the charge here, right? We know as readers now that he is the one without sin. But as John said earlier in his book in chapter 3, verse 17, for God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but to redeem the world through him. So Jesus and how he meets us in our sin, that's a crucially important question for all of us. Because we all have those moments, right? It's not maybe going to be so public. It's not going to be such a heated moment. And when I see Jesus meeting this woman, he's meeting her with compassion. He understands, as it says in Isaiah, we all like sheep have gone astray. But he also knows she hasn't had a shepherd, right? She hasn't had that loving, nurturing guidance that only he can provide. The other thing about the woman, how he interacts with her, is she is the only member in the story that gets his full attention. She is not just some pawn. He is giving dignity to this woman. And while he forgives her, like that does happen in the story, he also loves her enough to say, sin no more, right? Leave behind these things that are hurting you. Don't keep doing them. You see the results. They're things that you're ashamed of. They're things that lead to death. Leave that behind. It's hurting you. So those are our three characters, and we're going to just draw a quick lesson from each of them. Okay, so again, we had the crowd, disingenuous in their motivations. The woman, scared, embarrassed, ashamed, and Jesus. From the crowd, I think that the lesson that I would take away is Jesus is not putting up with our self-righteous games. Okay, he is not putting up with the times that we put other people down to make ourselves feel better. He's not letting us make other people a pawn in some game we're playing. We can't pick our favorite pet sins and hold people accountable to them if we're not serious about rooting out the sin in our own life. What he is concerned about, what he, I think, invites the crowd to and the woman to, is holiness, their own personal quest for it. The woman, so our second character that we talked about. When we look at the woman, I think we see Jesus being so well aware of our sin and shame, right? Sometimes we are the woman, yet he loves us anyways, right? He's meeting her so compassionately in that moment. He gives her dignity in that moment. She wasn't some pawn to Jesus. Likewise, you are important to Jesus, right? How he's meeting you when you mess up is with compassion, with understanding, and with an invitation to leave that behind. Don't do that anymore. And when I look at Jesus, so our third character, what I see is he's meeting people first with grace, right? If we are trying to spread the gospel, if we're trying to convince others that following Jesus is the way, it's not going to happen with us holding up signs saying you're a sinner and blah, 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 or you'll go to hell. But instead, compassion first, love first. And that doesn't mean that we don't ask them to change, right? Again, Jesus does. He says, sin no more. But he will change when they experience God's goodness, not his condemnation. Okay, and that's our story. I'll say that's actually all I have tonight. So I'm going to give you two questions to talk about with your table. So first one, there are three lessons that we talked about, one for each character. Which one resounds the most with you? And then the other one that I think maybe could be an interesting conversation is this story. Where do you see echoes of it in the world around us today? So I'll give you some time, 10 minutes to talk to your tables. Ready, go.